Here at this monument for a couple of reasons. One being that we are standing not too far from an important marker that's not this monument, but it's the place where a couple of sections of ground intersect or come together. And as near as I can tell from the record, if we were over here somewhere about in the middle of the intersection of Hackett and Summer Road, we would be at the corner of the two quarter sections of land that were purchased by those first two families, or first four families that came to the area in 1890. As near as I can tell from that point, looking to the southwest, you would find a quarter section that was purchased by Isaac Sommer and Ulrich Layman. They divided that quarter section in half, so they ended up with half of the quarter for each one of them. Looking to the northwest, you would find the quarter section that was purchased by David Kirchoffer and Peter Layman. They also divided it in half, and one had half and the other, but according to the information, they were considered to be sort of joint tenants of these land purchases that they made. I want to say just a few things about some of those first early settlers, and I think many of you recognize that this monument here has the names on it from the first cemetery that was used in the area by the Sonnenberg folks, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. But here's some of the folks that moved here to begin with. Peter Layman, and his name is listed on the sign here. He was considered by some to be the leader of the group that first settled in this area, those first four families. James O. Layman says he was well versed in the church affairs, but also in world geography and history. So he was well adapted for the new Sonnenberg settlement. Came with his wife Barbara Layman and 6 children, 5 of whom were girls. They added 2 more children after they arrived, and they happened to be the first 2 children who were born into the new Sonnenberg community. If you would look on the sign and notice the years, you would be able to tell that both Peter and Barbara died in the same year, 1843, 8 weeks apart. If you want to figure that up, that would be about 24 years after they arrived in this country. Second person I'll mention is Ulrich Layman. Ulrich was a bachelor when he came here to Sonnenberg. He was also a brother to Peter. He married a woman 3 years later, and we don't know a whole lot about her, Barbara Gerber, but she came over in 1822, so she was not in the first group that moved here, but perhaps in one of the earlier, the next groups. And somehow or another, Ulrich and Barbara were married 3.5 months after she arrived here at Sonnenberg. So I don't know if they knew each other before they came over here, or if he was just a really smooth talker, or just what. But it didn't take him long to find a wife after she came over. It was also the first wedding that took place here at Sonnenberg. So yeah, number of firsts for Ulrich. And again, I mentioned that he was a brother to Peter Layman. One of the other couples who came was Isaac and Katharina Layman, Layman Sommer, I should say. And Katharina was a sister to both Peter and Ulrich. So if you've kept track of all that, you'll know that out of the first 4 families that came, there were 2 brothers and 1 sister. It came as 3 of the 4 families. Isaac and Katharina was the youngest couple in the group. They brought 2 children with them. Christian, who was age 8 and who would later become a minister and a bishop in the congregation here. Isaac, and I don't know for sure, this would have been Isaac Jr., I assume, died by drowning at some age. We don't have that information for sure when. They had another 3rd son, Abraham, who was born 5 years after their arrival here. And according to James O. Layman, who I'm indebted to for a lot of the things that I'll be sharing tonight, it was recorded that Abraham was put out of the church, in quotes, for being addicted to the drink habit. So there were some of those kind of things that were a part of the life of those early settlers too. However, James also mentions that there were many descendants of the Summer family who would go on to become church leaders at Sonnenberg and the Salem churches. The fourth family group was David and Barbara Kirchoffer. David was age 60 when he came. His first wife had died in Switzerland, and he married again a person a bit younger than him. But they brought 12 living children with them, 11 girls and 1 boy. Isn't that a nice family to be traveling around the world with? And James mentions that within a year, 5 of those daughters may have gone, after they arrived here, might have gone back to Pennsylvania, where they had come through on their way here to work for families there and to raise some funds to help out with the expenses of the family here. Maybe they went back there to look for husbands too, I don't know, but anyway, there wouldn't have been a lot of choices from around here. David Kirchoffer lived to the age of 81, which makes it 21 years after he made the big decision to move his large family to the United States. His wife Barbara died 3 years later. As I mentioned, we're standing now in the corner of David Kirchoffer's farm. He donated land for the first church building that was built in 1834. It was located somewhere right in this corner of David Kirchoffer's place. Now, you should remember that when this took place, these roads weren't here. So there was probably paths through the woods, through the forest, that they moved back and forth on. And at some point they were able to build the church building here and needed to come and, yeah, thanks. Probably walked or perhaps rode horses sometimes, but to get to church and to visit each other. Now, from the very beginning in 1819 and for at least 13 years after the Sonnenberg congregation was actually initiated, they didn't have a church building. They met in homes around the community. And so it's kind of made me start thinking a little bit. Imagine what it would have been like when the first person in that group of early settlers died. Anybody know who that was? The first name up here on the list, Elizabeth Gerber, who was the wife of Ulrich Gerber, who was the first ordained minister. I believe it was minister, not the bishop, the first ordained minister who came over from Switzerland and began as leader of the church. And so within 1 year after they arrived here, Elizabeth passed away. Now, if you were here in this community, and I don't know if you can even imagine what it would have been like, but how would you decide where to have that burial? Where would you bury somebody? The church building wasn't here yet. Not really sure where the homes were. And I'm not really sure who all had come in the intervening years, but there was obviously a few other people that had arrived from Switzerland. And there must have been someone who had purchased the land just east of here. And the reason I say that is because those first burials took place about a quarter mile northeast from here. I think as the crow flies, it would be about that far. Over the time after that, for the next close to, well, it would be 30-some years. No, not quite that long, yeah, about 30-some years. The people who were buried were all buried back there in a place that was considered to be a cemetery. It was on private land, which makes me assume that it was probably a church member. But we don't know the information about how they decided on the spot. I've been back there and visited it, and the only reason I can think of is that it's on a little knoll out overlooking Sugar Creek Valley. So it would have been a very lovely place, and I don't know if that was an influence or not, but it makes sense that they would have picked a place like that for their first burials. And for the next 38 years until 1861, that plot of private ground served as the church cemetery. There were very few gravestones that were erected there. Somebody thought maybe they would have put wooden markers up at the time, but over the years those deteriorated. There was maybe a couple of stones that were discovered there back a few years ago. Those are either not there or pretty indistinguishable anymore now. And so there's nothing but a sign that one of the historical societies in the area put up to mark that as being a cemetery. And then about 100 years later, this monument was built to honor the memories of those early settlers. And this list that's on the monument here is not a complete list of all the burials that were over there. In fact, the records were really only kept for the church members, which meant they were been adults. And it's assumed that there could easily have been 58 to 60 adults that were buried back there, and then possibly that many more children that were not recorded in church records. Apparently there's some family history that they've done some research on and believe that there might have been that many. Now let me talk just a little bit about the church buildings as well. The first small church building, log cabin style, was built not too far from where you're standing. We don't know the exact location, but it would have been somewhere in this general area, and it was built in 1834. If you're going through the displays in the foyer, you'll see some pictures as well as some models that the kids have worked on to help you understand what that building looked like. The congregation outgrew that building fairly quickly. And so as we move west up toward the hill, we'll continue talking, because the second church building that was built 27 years later in 1861 was built higher up on this ridge towards which we were walking. This building was a bit larger, 30 feet square, had a fence around it. It had separate doors in the front for the men and women to enter. If you look at the model inside, again, you'll notice the unusual seating arrangement in this second church building. Again, it was divided kind of in the middle, but there were pews in one end of the building that were facing the middle, and then the pews on the other half of the building were also facing toward the middle. So there was a really unusual, I think unique style for the sanctuary in this second building. Tables in the middle is where the pastors and the song leaders would sit and would speak from. Before the third church building was built in, this second building was actually moved, and I don't have any idea how they moved it, but it said that they moved it north a ways to clear the space here for the building of the third building. That's the one that some of you still remember, and that third building was constructed in this same site in 1907. That's the building that was moved 11 years ago, or about 11 years ago, up to the Sonnenberg village, up to the road here about a half a mile. And many of you remember when that was moved, and yeah, we're here to see that happen. Now, the graves that we will visit this evening are not in any particular order, or definitely not in importance. I'm sure that you will have others that you would say, oh, we wish we would have stopped at that grave. Well, we couldn't cover them all, and these were suggested possibilities. I'm indebted to Cliff Layman for suggesting a number of these and doing some research on them, and also to James O. Layman for a lot of the information that he put together as a record of the cemetery here. There are a number of other resources and sources of information around, especially with the Kidron Historical Society. This stone with the orange flag here. Oh, I was also asked, and I'll mention it now, please do not push against or lean on the gravestones. Mike tells me that most of them are fairly solid, but some of them are not. So it would be best just not to bump against them too hard, and we'll try not to do any damage as we're walking through here. Christian I. Summer, and he's not so remarkable in a lot of ways, and yet there's some interesting things about his life. He was born in 1811 in Switzerland, baptized after he had come here to the Sonnenberg area in 1830. He married Tanya Geyser in 1838, and then he was chosen by lot and ordained as minister in 1844. So you kind of get a picture of the progression of his life. In 1862, the church needed a new bishop, to replace Peter Schneck, and we'll be visiting his grave in just a short time. Okay. Got too many things to hold. One of the things unusual about this ordination, and many of you will remember that pastors and bishops were usually chosen by lot for the first quite a number of years. For Peter, that didn't happen. For some reason or another, by the time the congregation was making a decision about calling Peter to his position, there was a consensus among the congregation, and so they basically asked the people from the congregation to come before the council, and so one by one they came in, and unanimously 72 men and 71 women voted unanimously to ordain Christian Summer as their bishop in 1862.
Women had a voice.
They did have a voice of vote at that point, and in that position of bishop, Peter was influential in some difficult decisions regarding Sunday school and prayer meetings that led to the beginning of the Salem congregation in 1886. Peter delivered his last sermon at Sonnenberg on September 28, 1891, and then died about 9 weeks later. There's a gravestone here that's marked Peter Mosher, or P. Mosher. It's got some initials on it. We're not going to give any story about that, but I just want to note that names were repeated often among those first generations of folks who lived here. And in fact, Peter is one of 3 Peter Moshers that are buried here in the cemetery, and there are a few names in which there's even more of that, more of the same name here in the cemetery. Peter Layman, here in the corner, was ordained as deacon in 1851. He was selected by lot, but again, his circumstances were a little bit unusual because he didn't happen to be there on the day when they were doing the selection by lot. There were 12 men who were in the lot that day, and so the pastors put 12 books up in the front of the sanctuary, and the men came up one by one and picked up a book. Only one of them would have had a slip of paper in it that had a marking, and when all the other 11 had selected their books, none of them had the mark. So Peter was notified upon his return that he had been selected by the lot to serve in the office of deacon, and 2 weeks later he was ordained. You will also note that there's these 2 flags here nearby. We believe that they were Peter's twin daughters, who died in 1861. Anybody recognize the significance of that date? Yeah, but there was also something that was happening here as well. You remember I said they were buried over in the old cemetery until 1860? As far as we know, these 2 daughters were probably the first 2 people that were buried over in this new cemetery. Now, the strange part about it is the land that was donated for the first church wasn't big enough for where they wanted to put the second and third churches. So they purchased some more land, some additional land, and while they were at it, they also wanted to add some land on for the cemetery over here. However, there was some kind of a mix-up about where the boundary of that new land was, and so when they buried the 2 daughters over here, they were too far west. And so there was an offer, I guess, to actually purchase more ground, and that didn't seem to work out or whatever, so they actually disinterred those 2 daughters and brought them back inside the boundary line for the cemetery. This may be one of the more familiar gravestones over here for many of you, partly because I think it was redone and the writing is much more clear on this particular stone than it is on a lot. Peter Schneck came to Ohio in 1824. He was chosen by lot and ordained as a minister in 1827, along with Ulrich Sommer at the same time. You may have heard me say already or know already that we celebrate the beginning of the Sonnenberg Church as a congregation in 1821. That is because that's when Bishop John Layman, who was ordained in Switzerland, came over to this area, and so they could have an ordained person in charge, and so we kind of date the origin of the church to that date. However, Bishop John Layman was removed from the office in 1827. There doesn't seem to be any history of why that happened, unless somebody else knows more about it. But at that point, Peter Schneck then was chosen by lot to serve as the bishop in 1829. That made him the first bishop who was actually ordained here at Sonnenberg. The sign talks about him being the founder. That's probably a little bit of a stretch because there already was a congregation before that time, and he would not have been the actual first bishop either. He would have been the first bishop that was ordained here in this community. And as far as we know, he was also the first adult burial here in the new cemetery. Left, is this Peter Mosher? All right, those of you that can see it. A little bit of story about Peter Mosher. He came with his family and his parents to Ohio in 1825. Peter was age 16 at the time, and the history records that he, anyway, and I assume some of the other rest of the family, walked most of the way from their home in Switzerland to Le Havre, France, got on a boat and crossed the ocean, and then walked from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to this area, which would have been at least a 3 or 4 week journey on foot. One of the things that I've learned as I've been doing this research is that among those early pioneer settlers, some of them, and maybe most of them, would have worn wooden shoes when they first came to this area. That was pretty common, I guess, back in the old country, and they were fairly inexpensive to make. And I guess if they were made well, they were somewhat comfortable anyway. Well, Peter saw this as an opportunity rather than a problem, and he started soon after he got here to apprentice in the cobbler trade. Spent about a year working with someone, and I don't know where or who it was, but learned the trade of making shoes, and then he went into business for himself. And back then, you didn't have a shop set up. He would actually go from house to house, measure your feet, and make you up a custom pair of shoes. He worked hard, he saved his money, bought land, and eventually Peter owned, it says, 700 acres up to the north from here. And Peter also has another record to his name. He died in 1905, at which age he was 98 years old and considered to be the oldest resident of Wayne County at that time. There's a record that says somewhere along the line that he celebrated his 90th birthday by driving his horse and buggy alone to Massillon and back. Is this John Stephan? Okay. Another Peter Mosher. Yeah, that's another one of the same persons by that name. We were going to check in on John Stephan's grave site too, and there we're right beside it there. Okay, we won't tell a story necessarily about John, but in a little bit later we'll hear a story of Daniel Stephan, and John would have been his father. I think we'll go down here to Matthias Gerber. Watch your footing. I know it's a little rough around here. Matthias Gerber, and I believe his wife is right back there. Is that right? There's a fair amount of information about Matthias, other than the fact that he was the great-grandfather of Cliff Layman and Gladys Amstutz, if you know either of those people. And so the information that we have is taken from a paper that was written by Gladys. Matthias was born in Switzerland in 1828. He was at the age when he was called to register for the military draft when he turned 24. But the story is that he showed up for the physical that they needed to take, but he was standing in line during that time and he saw a side door and he slipped out the door and didn't go through with the physical, didn't go any further with the draft, and shortly after that, he and two of his sisters sailed from Le Havre, arriving in New York in 1853. Now, I wouldn't say he was actually running from the draft, but it seems like it worked out that way. In 1862, he married Dinah Mosher. They had 4 children. Matthias farmed some land down near Sonnenberg Station, but he was also a woodworker, worked in construction and that sort of thing. And so in 1883, Matthias and Dinah sponsored a family coming to Sonnenberg from Switzerland, the John Mishler family. The Mishler family was apparently not Mennonite, but they lived with the Gerbers for several months and then moved to their home in or near Moscow. Does anybody know where Moscow was? Not much of a town there anymore, okay? Up at near the intersection of Route 30 and Kidron Road was an area that was known as Moscow back many, many years ago. This John Mishler, who came and lived with the Gerbers, was a linen weaver by trade. So Matthias used the woodworking skills that he had and built a solid cherry wood weaving loom for John. John took the weaving loom with him when he moved his family to Smithville sometime later and started the Mishler Manufacturing Company. And that loom is now on display up at the Smithville Historical Society. So it dates back quite a number of years ago, but if you're ever up there, you can connect it back to Matthias, who actually built the loom here in the Sonnenberg area. 2 of Matthias's sons then, Valentine and Jacob, were the ones who started the Kidron auction. I don't have a date on that, simply that they ended up selling it to Cy Sprunger for $5. The son Jacob, one of them married Lina Summer, who was the daughter of Bishop Christian and Barbara Summer that we talked about before. There's some people here that still remember her. She was of small stature but a very warm and friendly disposition. Died in 1971 at the age of 96. Jacob was also known as the only bald man to sit up in the amen corner of the old church. Apparently had a rather unique laugh and a deep bass voice that was heard all over the church. Christian and Adela Summer. Here. Christian and Adela Summer are just basically folks that you might think about as being the parents and grandparents of Cy and John Sprunger, the ones that now are operating the Kidron auction barn. And then we have Christian and Marianne Summer. I'm sorry, I said Summer before. This one was Sprunger. Okay, right? And then we're looking for Christian and Marianne Summer. Down here. Some of you would remember better who this Marianne Amstutz was. when I tell you that she was one of the Amstutz family that you will hear a little bit more about for the next 2 or 3 stops that we're going to make. And Virginie, if you want to step over here and use the microphone and tell us the story about Mariana.
I got my information from Susan Amstutz's Amstutz book. She was Anna Maria, usually known as Mary Ann Amstutz. She was one of the Schweizerstutz. She was born on September 10, 1858 in Switzerland. She attended school at Bandorf, France. She was baptized into the Mennonite Church at the age of 12 in April 1871. 1 month later, she emigrated with her parents, Johann and Katharina, and 5 brothers, to the Sonnenberg community in Ohio. To differentiate them from other Amstutzes, the family was given the nickname Schweizerstutz. Mary Ann was known as the songbird of the family. She was a Sunday school teacher of 10-year-old girls. She led many singing schools in the Sonnenberg community, encouraging children to sing and read music. She occasionally led singing in the church. She often sang soprano as she sang with her brothers. She led the way to thinner black head coverings. She was also the first president of the sewing circle. She even mowed the church lawn in later years. At the age of 27, she married Christian A. Summer. Their home was never blessed with children. Her husband died in 1929 at age 82, and Mary Ann died a year later at the age of 71.
And we have a couple of others, those same family of Amstutzes. Daniel Amstutz, and his grave is on up that direction just a little ways. Or Jacob, which one is Jacob? You're right, I never did get him written in here. Yeah, actually, we'll probably won't go back to the time to do it.
Okay.
Cliff is over there.
Okay, and I'll probably where we're headed, then where Cliff is out over there.
He's way over there, y'all.
That's Jacob and Daniel. Okay, we'll get them later. This is Jacob.
Jacob Amstutz was one of the Schweizerstutz. He was born in Switzerland on April 4, 1856. At age 12, he worked away from home to help meet the family's financial needs. During this time, he attended French school and became very fluent in that language. Jacob was 15 years old when he came to America in 1871 with his parents, Johann and Katharina, 4 brothers, John, Abraham, Daniel, Benjamin, and 1 sister, Mary Ann. This family was referred to, as I mentioned, the Schweizerstutz, a musical group that became famous. In fact, Verl Krotzer mentioned it last evening over at the hymn sing. They sang German hymns, sometimes at secular occasions, such as Farmers' Institutes. They had 1 record cut, a cylinder record of an early type. On December 1, 1883, at age 27, Jacob married Verena, called Fanny Gerber. They had 9 children: Simon, Rhoda, Lina, which would be my grandma, Louis, Bishop Louis Amstutz, Emma, Enos, Edna married Aaron Layman. Daniel and Albert, Michael Amstutz's great-grandpa. He died at age 87 years, 2 months, and 23 days.
Okay. I probably misspelled that. It would be his grandpa. We're not going to walk over there right at the moment, but another one of that same family, Daniel Amstutz, his grave is just up this way a little way, so we're headed back down this way. But if you want to read about Daniel, that'll be fine.
Okay. Daniel H. Amstutz was the third son of Johann and Katharina Amstutz, who emigrated to America in 1871. He was born April 1, 1851, and was 20 years old when his parents, 4 brothers and 1 sister, came to the Sonnenberg community. And again, he's one of the Schweitzer Stutz, and became a famous musical group. He was an early Sunday school teacher. He was also a song leader for 50 years. At the new church dedication in 1907, his sister, Marianne, and he led a 1-hour-long song service after lunch. He was a farmer, and he furnished by far the most milk, 69,960 pounds, for which he received $792.36. He also helped to promote the Kidron Horse Company. He provided the barn to keep the 2 draft stallions. He married Fanny Swartz. They had 2 sons and 5 daughters. 2 years after Fanny died, he married Melinda Mosher Gerber. In 1906, Daniel made a return trip to Switzerland. He died suddenly at the age of 76 years and 5 months. His funeral was the largest assembly of 1,200 people at Sonnenberg.
And I believe someone said along the way they couldn't have gotten 1,200 people in the church. How did that work? And they thought probably the doors and windows were open and people were gathered around the outside so they could hear what was going on. You might also be interested in knowing Daniel is the father of Vic Gerber. That name might ring familiar to some of you. He also was a song leader at Sonnenberg, as well as a well-known band and chorus leader up at the Dalton High School. And just for another connection, if you want, Vic is in the same family line as Max Gerber. Many of you will know him as the longtime manager of Kidron Town and Country. So that's all in that family line. If you turn around, Cliff is down toward that end. You can walk down there if you want to, but we really don't have much of a story about John Falk, except that John was chosen to be what was called the master builder for the Third Mennonite Church, the Third Sonnenberg Church in 1907. So John Falk would have been one of the persons who was primarily in charge of that building. Oops, that's fine. Now, I just want you to notice one thing as we're walking right through this area. You'll notice there's a little extra space between these rows of gravestones, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one is that all of the stones or all of the graves to the west of this line, the gravestones is sitting at the east end of the graves. The graves are all on the west side of the stones. Over here, you'll note that the graves are all on the east side of the stones. I'm not quite sure what the history of that is, other than I'm aware that at some period in time there was some conversations about the Lord's coming again, coming in the skies from the east, right? So these folks that were buried over here are going to have a head start all over all those that are buried over on that side.
Which other cemeteries do that?
Yeah, there are a lot of
They're
cemeteries
facing
that
east.
are...
And I talked to Paul Hildy, who used to be sexton here, and I just was asked Paul Hildy back a couple weeks before he died about the change, and he had mentioned the east.
Okay.
That was the point of it when they started into this section.
Okay, yeah. Well, it may have even had something to do with that song about the eastern sky. You remember that? there was a song that got popular about that time. The other reason that there's a space here is because they wanted to allow room for a driveway to come back through here in case they needed to expand the cemetery on farther north at some point. And we were looking at pictures earlier. This is about as far as the cemetery was for quite some time until they started expanding, and now you see how much farther it's gone. So over the years, we assume that their cemetery will need to be bigger. Abraham Nussbaum. Down here on the end, again, there's not a story to go with her, but other than the fact that Abraham was Esther Stephan's grandfather. Okay, and some of you that knew Esther Stephan, who lived to the ripe old age of 104, 105. This would have been her grandfather that's buried down there.
This is John Paul, who's that Albert
You
there.
mentioned John Paul.
Mm-hmm.
I could just do the Daniel Stephan. He raised Daniel Stephan.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we're running out of time, so maybe we just won't. Fred Geyser.
Back here.
Okay. Again, he was one of the persons who helped to build the 1907 church building. Fred was trained as a cabinet maker before that time, and so if you have ever seen the old pulpit, I believe it's over in the old church building at the Sonnenberg village now. Fred was the one who built that pulpit that's over there. Some of us saw that last night at this inspiration, I believe. Jacob Nussbaum.
Up here.
Okay. Kind of an interesting story about Jacob. He was born not in this community, but near Bluffton, Ohio, in 1862. Jacob and with his family moved to Bern, Indiana while he was just a youngster, and he joined the Mennonite church there. His wife, Anna Neuenschwander, was born in Bern, but in Bern, Switzerland, in 1866. And the family moved over here to Sonnenberg community when she was 8 years old. And then a few years later, her family also moved to Bern, Indiana, where she joined the church over there. And so Jacob and Anna both ended up over in Bern, Indiana at a fairly young age. They were married then in 1887, and a few years later in 1903, they moved back here to Sonnenberg. Along the way, and I don't know exactly which of those years, they had 17 children. 11 who still survived at the death of Anna. And a news article about Anna's death says that she suffered from a fall, and then one morning as she was getting up and trying to dress her sore limb, I'm not sure whether it was an arm or a leg, she passed out. She was revived, but then died 45 minutes later. The article continues, although her illness was of a short duration, she had always expressed her readiness to go and be with her Lord. And in the departure of their sister, the church loses a faithful member, the family loses a loving and devoted mother, and the community loses one who was loved and respected by all who knew her. Jacob had some years before suffered from a condition that was called dropsy of the heart. Now, I don't know how it would be named right now, but Anna had cared for him for several years before her death, and it actually says that during those years Jacob was thought to be near death several times, but always recovered. But he did die 3 years after her, and a note says he was unnoticed by the family who was attending him for a little bit. Of special note in James O. Layman's book, Jacob is said to have hauled the logs from the surrounding area to be cut up and used for the church building, the old Sonnenberg church building in 1907. With his large family, I don't know if any of his children were there to help him with that big task, but if you ever have the opportunity to go up in the attic over at the old church, you can look and see some of those timbers that were cut out of the logs that were hauled over to be used by Jacob. I think we'll still take time for a few more. Peter Huber, or Huebner. I sort of figured I'd have more people lined up on my list here than what we'll have time to go and actually stop at each grave, but this is kind of an interesting story that I wanted to relate to you. Peter Huebner does not come from a Swiss background. Unlike many of the early people that lived here in this community, Peter was born into a relatively wealthy family in the Ukraine region of Russia in 1898. He came to America with a group of 62 Russian immigrants sponsored by Mennonite Central Committee at the time. And so he came over with quite a number of people in 1921. Sonnenberg had actually contributed some financial help to make that movement possible. And so probably because of that, we're not quite sure, but Peter and I think it said at least a half a dozen of that group came and lived here in Sonnenberg. The rest of the group went on farther west and settled in some other areas. Peter came and made his home with the Gerber family for a time. In 1924, he married Selma Zimmerly, who was a resident of Sonnenberg. Cliff Layman pointed this name out to me early on because he had found a long wooden pole that was used to lower the top windows in the old church building. You can still see that pole. It's on display there in the foyer. And he remembers Peter maybe was one of the persons that for a time was responsible for using that pole to raise and lower the windows. For reasons unknown, Peter and his wife became members of the CMA Church in Orville for the last number of years of their life, but upon their death, both he and Selma came back here to be buried. Someone in the group, if I remember right, mentioned the name Cleophas Amstutz. Is that somebody that... Okay. Yeah, where's... Thought we had a flag there. Oh, not farther? Okay. Cleophas was a Sonnenberg minister. One of the things that we know about him was that he was a strong promoter of the idea of Sunday school. This would have been in a bit later years after there was a division in the church because of the Sunday school issue, but later Cleophas would have been one of the ones who spoke up for a Sunday school here and became the first Sunday school superintendent here at Sonnenberg. Edward Zimmerly, there on the end. I don't know that we really know much of a story about Edward, but Cliff says he is the grandfather of the current Holmes County Sheriff. Lana Gerber is right next there. Again, she's a descendant of the Eli Amstutz and Layman family. I think she was mentioned earlier in one of the stories that was told. Ben Geyser. Back down here. That one, the one down there? Okay, we don't need to move over there. We don't, again, have a lot of story. Didn't have time to look up a lot of the references that we wanted, but just point out some of them. Ben and Alan and some of the rest of that Geyser family. Ben was a Sonnenberg deacon, and he owned farm ground over near Kidron. Alan was also a farmer and donated land for the building of the Central Christian School and MCC Connection building there in Kidron. Alan's up here. And you said this was a family of geysers, so if you happen to look along the row here, you'll see about five or six different geysers from the same family that are buried here almost in a row. Okay, let's skip on over to Louis Amstutz, right up here. We'll need to wrap this up pretty quickly so we can get back over to the church in time to start the gathering there. But Louis is a kind of an important person in the history of Sonnenberg. He was born in 1889, north of Oroville. He married Adela Layman in 1912. He farmed in the Kidron area. He was ordained as a minister at Sonnenberg in 1925. And then he was ordained as bishop in 1932. One of the things that we read about Lewis is that he was one of the first Sonnenberg ministers to preach only in English. And before that, a lot of the preachers had preached in German, and then for a period of time there were some that preached sometimes in German and sometimes in English. But James records that Lewis wasn't comfortable speaking in German, and so from the time he was ordained, he always preached in English. He attended a winter Bible school at Eastern Mennonite School in Virginia at some point in his life, and when he came back from there, he had picked up some of the customs of the church in Virginia, and so he asked the leadership of Sonnenberg for permission to wear a plain coat. Many of you will understand what that means, but apparently they gave him permission, and Lewis was the first person that we're aware of who actually wore the plain coat here at Sonnenberg. It states that after he started, then there were a number of other people that also took up the practice of wearing a plain coat. Lewis also initiated the writing of several documents that sort of spelled out some pretty strict dress codes and certain activities that were forbidden for members of the church. He also started the practice of foot washing, which had not been done here before, and a number of those things were sort of unpopular with the congregation. You can kind of imagine a little bit of the rebellion that happened when he tried to say about things that needed to happen or not happen. So he was opposed in several of those initiatives by a group of younger members of the congregation. That division came to a head with the request in 1935 to join Ohio Conference. Ohio Conference at that time was known as a bit more liberal, and that led to some further dissension. That dissension led to the division that brought about Kidron Mennonite in 1936. That was a time of much transition at Sonnenberg, including the move to affiliate with Virginia Conference, which happened a short time after that. Then Lewis stepped down as bishop in 1961 at the age of 72, after quite a period of turbulence in the church. On a more positive note, we read that Bishop Amstutz donated land across the road from the church, church would have been on this side at that time, donated the land across the road from the church where the Sonnenberg Mennonite School was built in 1947. That's the old part of the building that's there now. And on a lighter note, Louis and Elda had a house guest that lived with them for a number of years. Some of you may recall the story, or the person, a man by the name of Fred Barchi, who was a shoestring and comb salesman. Also, I guess, a bit of a hobo, and had traveled around for some time before that, but after he arrived here at Sonnenberg, kind of settled down and lived with Louis and Elda for a number of years and became a member of the church here. Just a couple of others that we will mention quickly. Ray Himes. Okay, down to the left down there, was invited to come from Florida to serve as a part-time Sonnenberg pastor in 1965. Ray also worked as a mason and block layer, and I understand he even helped with the kitchen addition that was built onto the school up here at some point in time. He was pastor for 18 years and died in 1985. And then one more that we will mention, or a couple more yet. Over here somewhere, there's a stone with 3 names on it. Okay. On farther over in the corner. And if you take the time to walk over there, you'll find that that stone has the name of 3 women: Pauline, Edith, and Twyla Amstutz. And some of you will quite possibly remember some of those ladies. They never married, but they stayed in this community and taught school, as well as Sunday school and Bible school. And I hear they were really wonderful teachers in their time. From here, we're going to move up along the road this direction, and we'll stop about halfway to the road up here just to say a few more things. If you're real familiar with the cemetery, you will recognize that in this first row next to the road here, as well as in the second or third row in scattered places, are the names of a number of young children and infants who were buried here over the years. A couple of notes that I will mention to you. Patricia Amstutz gravesite is right here. Patricia was the daughter of Doyle and Ella Amstutz, and when we were inviting people to suggest names for this cemetery tour, Ada Amstutz contacted me and wanted me to just mention that when Patricia died as a very young child, Ada had just given birth, or just shortly gave birth, to her daughter, and she says it was a very difficult time because she had a hard time celebrating the birth of her daughter when Ella and Doyle were still suffering from the loss of theirs. So that's some of the interaction we could think about as well, and the death of some of these folks that were a part of the cemetery. Also next to her is a lady named Tanya Geyser, lived only a short time as well. And very many of these graves along here, some of them a matter of days or just a few years. We also have a burial right on the end of that line of the daughter of Chip and Martha Coleman, my daughter's son, sorry, just not very many years ago, and was buried there. There would be many other stories, and I just remind us that each one of these stones represent a life, a story, and lots of wonderful memories for families and people who knew them and look back at them and recall the story of their lives. And so to conclude our time here in the cemetery, it suggested that we could maybe sing a couple of verses of song, When the Roll is Called Up Yonder, I'll Be There. Dottie will lead us.
The first begins when the trumpet of the Lord shall sound. The second is bright and cloudless morning. When the trumpet of the Lord shall sound, and time shall be no more, and the morning breaks eternal, bright and fair. When the saints of earth shall gather over on the other shore, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. On that bright and cloudless morning, when the dead in Christ shall rise, and the glory of His resurrection share. When the chosen ones shall gather on the other side, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there.
Thanks to all of you for coming out here and spending this little time together. I hope that you found it enjoyable and at least memorable. And if you have other stories that this sparked in your memory, we're going to be going over to the church here in a few moments, starting another gathering there. And I can Nussbaum's going to be in charge of that, but I think he's going to give some opportunity for you to share stories or memories if you would like to do that. So if you have thought of something that could have been said out here, yeah, go ahead and share it over there. That'll be fine too. Thanks.
We kind of like our 10-year, maybe 15-year, and then we put somebody inside that didn't follow through.